Interim Charge 7 to make funding recommendations for the phased installation of climate control equipment in state correctional facilities. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice was asked to draft a plan that would provide air conditioning for all inmate housing while prioritizing facilities that serve vulnerable populations. The four-phase draft is being presented today, and it's a starting point for discussion. The chair calls Brian Collier, Executive Director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bonin,
Afternoon.
Vice Chair Gonzalez, members. I'm Brian Collier, Executive Director of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and I have Ron Steffa, our CFO, with me as well. The information that we're providing in the handout, I'll walk through, but certainly answer any questions you may have along the way. I wanted to give you kind of a baseline of where we are today, what we've done over the last few years, and then what would be the phased-in plan that you had requested. So moving to slide 2, just to kind of give you a baseline of what is air conditioned right now in TDCJ. We have 14 units that have no air conditioning at all. We have 55 units that have some limited air conditioning in housing, and that could be as small as under 25 beds up to 1,800 beds. But the average of their 50 of those units have less than 25 beds that are air conditioned, just to kind of give you a feel for that. We also have 31 units in the system that have air conditioning in all our housing areas. And right now, if you bring down the total, you're looking at a total of 41,000 air conditioned beds in the system today. Moving to slide 2, just to kind of give you an update on projects that we've done over the last few years. Starting in 2018, we've expanded air conditioning beds. In 18 and 19, we did sheltered housing units for our geriatric housing. We did 149 beds with air conditioning. In 20 and 21, we did 2,493 beds. We air conditioned the PAC and the Hodge unit. In FY22, we also did additional sheltered housing beds, and these were all based on funding that you provided. We did 956 more beds. We currently have active projects on 5,861 beds at our intake facilities. It wouldn't completely air condition those, but it would give us some air conditioned housing at those intake facilities, because as we bring inmates in from county jails, they have air conditioning in county jails, so acclimating them into those air conditioned beds would prevent us from having to move them if they're heat vulnerable. So those beds would be online at the end of 23. So once we're done with that, we would have about 47,000 air-conditioned beds in the system, and that will be at the end of FY23. The next slide, slide 4, just shows you what we do about heat-vulnerable inmates in the system. So we have a system where our medical providers have a scoring system based on the several factors. It can include age, weight, body mass, but it can also include any medications, lots of other factors that can make you heat sensitive. If you, upon intake, are identified as someone who has a heat vulnerability, then we move you to an air-conditioned bed. And that's how we manage our air-conditioned beds now. We move our heat-vulnerable inmates to those beds. There's about 12,000 inmates that are identified as heat vulnerable based on the heat score, and that changes pretty consistently because medication may change and that puts somebody in it. But that's around 12,000 is the typical number. We also have a wide array of things we do to manage heat in the system, because obviously it's very hot inside our institutions that are not air conditioning or don't have air conditioned housing areas. So we do a wide range.
Real quick, just for context, what's your population currently?
It's today 120,000. We hit 120 today. It's been around 118, 119. Pre-COVID, just to give you that, in case it was 142, we dropped down to a low of 116, and we're around today 120. With our regular population, so these are people not in air conditioning, but also to include those, we do a wide range of things that start in about April of every year as far as a campaign to educate. We also have respite areas where an inmate can say, I need to get into a cool area, so we take them. That can be in an education building, a chapel. It can be in the medical area, but they can go in that area and basically cool off before we return them back to their housing area. We provide extra ice and water in our housing areas. We provide cooling towels. We provide fans. Inmates can also buy fans. We do training posters and training with the inmates and our staff on what to look for, but also helping our staff mitigate the heat as well, because obviously they're in it as well. We have for the last several years, been buying as we replaced buses. We've been buying air-conditioned buses, and we currently have 93 of our buses that are air-conditioned and 310 of our vans that are air-conditioned. And we try to use those transports during the cooler times of the day. We also lower shower temperatures in the summer months so that our showers that are hot are not as hot as they would be during typical winter months. This last session, there was a Rider 56 that was added that requires us to take a daily temperature of any facility that is not air-conditioned in a housing area every day at 3 o'clock. We do that, and I thought I would give you just a kind of a snapshot of the last 10 days because obviously the heat in the last 10 days has been pretty intense. The average over the last 10 days has been 91.4, and this is inside a housing area of a non-air-conditioned unit. We've had 5 units that have been over 100 degrees in the housing area over the last 10 days. And this, again, 3 o'clock every day, we check that temperature. On slide 5, you will see the proposed plan that we provided to you as a committee based upon your request. And I'll kind of walk you through what that plan would be, but it would be 4 phases over the course of 4 biennium to help get the complete system air conditioned. Part of the reason for the window of time that we have in there is the availability of contractors and equipment, but also the design process because many of these have to be designed. Even though we have done many designs, each one of these major projects has to be designed and then built, and that takes some amount of time. If you look at phase 1, that estimated cost would be $225.9 million. It would do design and construction for 16 facilities and then have a design as well on another 20. It would add 24,825 beds to the system. It would focus on intake facilities and our geriatric or special needs facilities. So any of those that are not air conditioned would be our first priority. As you move into phase 2, that is a $319.3 million item. That would design and or construct air conditioning on 30 facilities and then design only 12. It would be another 37,289 facilities. What we're looking at in that second phase are your prototype units that are built in similar fashion. So we have several thousand bed units that would be hopefully similar designs so that we could move quickly to do many of them at the same time. As you get into phase 3, that's $322.4 million. That's a design only of 11, but construction of 12. Adding air conditioning to 12, that would be 28,841 beds that would be air conditioned. That would be beginning our older facilities. So many of our older, some of them very large facilities, we would begin with that next step in phase 3. Phase 4 would be the oldest of our facilities. They're going to be the most complicated based on their design and the age of the facilities. We would add construction of 11, design and construction of 4. That would be 22,820 beds that we would add then. That would also include our idled. We have 4 idle facilities. Obviously, if our population doesn't rise, we wouldn't need those, but we put them in the phase 4, assuming that at that time, if our populations had returned to where they once were, that we would need to do those facilities as well. But the overall cost is a $1.1 billion item. The way we come about the cost, we have engineers on staff at TDCJ who have done design estimates, but we also farmed out 2 of our projects to independent design firms. We did 2 different firms, basically as a check to see how our engineers' numbers were. And both of those came back right at where our engineers proposed it. So we feel confident that our engineers have a good handle on what we're doing based on the experience they've had in the system and then adding it. So we feel like the 1.1 would be an appropriate number. We think that also you have to figure it's not exactly $5 million, but you can see it in the far column. We have operating costs that would pick up as you add that to it for electricity maintenance and upkeep. That would pick up after about the last of it. It would be a total of about $20 million from then on.
All right, Vice Chair Gonzalez.
Thank you, Chairman. We've had this conversation multiple times now,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
thank you so much for continuing to educate us on the problems of the prison air conditioning issue. Just a couple of questions on the
Yes, ma'am.
heat sensitivity. Can you give me that number again of how many inmates are heat
It's right around 12,000.
12,000. And so you have to coordinate moving 12,000 inmates when you're already pretty much at capacity. Does that feel accurate?
The most complicated part of it is when we get someone in the system. So if we get an inmate today in the system at, say, an intake unit, they need to be in a heat-sensitive bed, we're going to have to do it today. So we have to have medical do that assessment very quickly, and then we're going to get that individual, try to move to an air-conditioned bed today. Once we're settled and in those beds, it becomes a little bit more manageable. It's not the best situation at all, because where we have air-conditioned beds isn't necessarily where any of these want to go. So you have 12,000 people who have to go to air conditioning, but at the same time, it may uproot from a family that's in this part of the state and put them over here based on the fact that we have an air-conditioned bed available for that individual. So it's certainly not ideal. It's just a way to hopefully mitigate it for right now.
Of course, not ideal, but also creates, I think we can just look at it in isolation, like, oh, they don't have air conditioning, but there's a domino effect.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think what's really important for the committee is to recognize all the complications that result from one issue not being addressed. So it's not only having to move 12,000 people, that's a huge amount of folks trying to
Yes,
get
ma'am.
moved to different parts of the state. But also, can you talk a little, and I know we'll have somebody testify about this, but staff recruitment and retention, can you give us some of those numbers and the
Sure.
and the impact and implication of not doing some of what you're asking for?
Well, I would tell you that, it's obviously, it's not identified as a specific, hey, we can't recruit because of that, but I can absolutely tell you it's a very difficult part of the job. Being a correctional officer is not an easy job to begin with, but doing it in the heat we're in right now. I was in a housing area about a month ago in Houston, in a housing area on a Saturday afternoon at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was 94 degrees in the housing area. That's in the day room area with fans blowing, so it's hot. I know our folks get acclimated, but at the same time, it's hot. It makes a draining day. So it's difficult. If it was an air conditioning environment, would it help our recruiting and retention? I can only just tell you, I would believe it would, but I can't prove to you that it would. But I can tell you, one, I would like to say thank you for what you did for us recently, because of the pay increase that we have implemented. We've gone from 8,000 vacancies down to 7,000 since April. So we've made significant strides in the last 3 months based upon what we've done with the pay package that you were allowing us to do. But at the same time, being able to retain staff is the most important part. And obviously working in that kind of environment is tough.
Just 2 more questions. The rider that you alluded to about taking the temperature every single day, do you feel that having that additional data has supported greater transparency and maybe even better public policy?
I think so, and I think it helps us as well, because every one of us see it as well. So I think all our staff, our wardens see it, our staff see it. So we all know it's hot, but seeing the actual temperature and knowing what that is, I still think it has been a benefit. Yes, ma'am.
And even though this is a difficult and sad question, has anyone passed away because of heat-related, that heat-related issue?
There have been heat-related deaths in the agency. The last was in 2012. We had, I believe, 17 prior to 2012. That's from 2000 to 2012. 10 of those were in 2011, but none since 2012.
All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate your answers.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, Representative Sherman.
Thank you, Chairman Bonin, and thank you again. I want to thank you publicly for ensuring that this is on the agenda, and Vice Chair Gonzalez as well. Thank you for your heart and work that you put into this. Brian Collier, we're
Yes, sir.
talking quite a bit, and I just want to ask a few questions
Sure.
in regards to the Rider 56 pertaining to taking the temperatures
Yes, sir.
inside the prisons. What is the methodology for taking the temperature? Meaning, do we have a thermostat that's stationed in a building? Where is it in proximity to the housing unit? And if you could answer those.
Sure. It's a handheld device, if I'm not mistaken, that goes into, it'd be a warden or major supervisor, could be a major captain or a warden or assistant warden, that goes in, checks the temperature, and they would go into the same housing area every day, same area, and they would, sometimes these devices have to be calibrated before you're in there, but they would go through that process and then record the temperature at 3 o'clock. And then record that gets sent in as well, so that we have that count at the agency level based on each day.
Are there any instructions on how long the major or assistant warden should be in the exact room where they're taking the temperature?
We gave specific training to our staff when as we rolled it out, and we continue to update that as we do it every year. So we have trained on it, yes, sir, specifically on that, as well as on the air-conditioned facilities. We actually monitor temperatures as well, and we've trained on that process as well.
But in the AC units, you have a thermostat that's built in, right?
We have actually a Kestrel that's actually a device that measures temperature, and then we go by and read it at a location.
Is there a reason we do not have a stationary thermostat that's in the room and not relying on an individual to be able to go in at the exact time every day?
And well, the exact time is conducted, so 3 o'clock is what we do. But as far as having some kind of permanent device, I can verify because we may have it in some locations where we actually have a Kestrel device there, and we're monitoring that. But I can verify that and give it to you because I don't want to be incorrect. But I don't know that they're all handheld, but I do know I believe some of them are.
And I appreciate your sensitivity to the veracity of the information you're providing.
Yes, sir.
Because this does affect human life. And I was talking to Representative Wilson, Chairman Wilson, earlier, and just mentioned that scripturally, Proverbs 12:10 says that a righteous person treats their animals right. We're not talking about animals. And some are guilty and some are innocent. We don't always get it right. Is there a location where these temperatures are taken? Because in structures, obviously, the sun rising on the east and going to the west, there are certain areas that are going to be experiencing hotter temperatures in that structure. So was there thought given to where we take the temperature?
There was instruction given to our wardens, so we gave our wardens instruction to identify housing areas that are not climate controlled. We don't do the 3 o'clock on air conditioning. We have a permanent system in the air conditioning units, but on a non-air conditioned unit, you pick a housing area, you consistently go to that same housing area, the same area of that housing area every day at 3 to monitor that temperature and verify that. Now, I don't believe that we went through a process and said, hey, take one at every housing area and try to find the high mark if there is, because I understand exactly what you're saying, because there may be variations of a few degrees, one or the other, but I don't believe we did that before we settled on. We trusted the wardens to identify a housing area and be transparent about it, and our regional directors helped look at that as well.
How do you validate that they did it?
Really through our chain of command. I know that I trust the wardens to have done it and done it correctly, because I know the regional directors also went in and looked at where they had it and had an approval process to say that that's an okay area to do it in. And they understand the sensitivity of the heat and the fact that there's nothing to hide. We absolutely want to do it consistently and do it correctly.
And I meant verify.
Yes, sir.
Verify it. So the warden takes that every day, but is there any reason that we would want to free up that job to have a stationary thermostat in the most hot area, the hottest area of the facility?
It would probably make more sense to have something that's permanent that actually you can read from a different location. The same with our air-conditioned facilities, just we have not moved to that level.
We're all familiar with Nelson Mandela, who served 27 years in prison in South Africa, and it is said that no one truly knows a nation until one has been inside its jails. A nation should not be judged by how it treats its highest citizens, but its lowest citizens. I was visiting in Marlin,
Yes, sir.
the hobby unit, and I believe in the Holy Spirit, so I felt convicted to go by there. And when I went in, it's a women's unit, and there was a young lady, middle-aged white woman, who had come back to it's a dorm style.
Yes, sir.
You've got the prisons that have two in a prison cell.
Cell block.
And then you've got cell block. And then you've got the dorm style. And she was in a dorm style, and she was apologizing to me because she said, "I'm sorry, sir, I'm sweaty," because I was shaking people's hands.
Yes, sir.
And she said, "I just came back from work." I said, well, and there are jobs there, industry,
Yes, sir.
canneries, desk, and all sorts of products that these citizens produce. I said, what is your job? She says, I work on ACs and heat. There was no AC in her dorm. I know you're saying 14% have no air conditioning in housing areas, but many of the units that I've gone to have no AC in the housing units. But we do have we have AC in the warden's office. We have AC in the chapel. We have AC in the commissary. But we don't have AC in housing. And temperatures, even for the pets, we're told never to have your temperature set, if you have an indoor pet, above, I believe it's 76 degrees or 78. If you go to 85, it's a danger zone. There are a lot of things that we could do better. So I just want to, I see your projections on what the fiscal impact would be.
Yes, sir.
To this. And I really, really thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity for us to engage and talk about this, because this is about being politically humane. If we look at what we did at the PAC unit,
Yes, sir.
as an example, you mentioned the PAC unit, and that was compulsory. Would you agree that?
Correct. We did that as a part of a court settlement, absolutely.
So we spent millions of dollars fighting that case. And in the end, humanity won out. So we have AC. But in the interim, we had a period where we had to install temporary ACs.
Yes, sir.
And I believe the cost was a little north of $200,000. Is that? I could look at my numbers, but I don't want to go too long.
I don't have PAC. I can tell you, though, because we've done it we had to do temporary air conditioning at Briscoe and Segovia.
Briscoe and Segovia.
Yes, sir.
And that's a good point. Now, why did we have to put temporary AC in those two units?
To meet jail standards, because
Meet
that's a
jail-
jail standard in Texas. Jails have to be air conditioned, and those two facilities are functioning as a jail.
At the same time, those jails had been housing Texans for years
Yes, sir.
with no AC.
Correct.
We then took undocumented people, we moved Texans out and placed undocumented people in those prisons, and then we installed temporary AC. I just, for the life of me, don't, and it's not on you. I think this sits with us. How it is that we can take taxpayer dollars and not use those dollars to provide humane conditions in our prisons for Texans, but then we can cross the border and we will comply with that. And again, I think that lies with us and a conscious decision that we've made. So I thought about, well, the cost seems to be something that is considered a barrier. So what if we simply, as a legislative body, said we're going to do a rider for 4 months of the year for temporary AC? So the hottest times of the year in Texas, we're providing temporary AC, which is far less than what your projection is. Just going on actual cost, we're looking at approximately $30 million, and not billion with a big B. And we're providing humane conditions for the times that we need them. And I think that's a decision that business people would make in order to meet the needs of jail standards for Texans who deserve to have that. Because in the end, I think we have a responsibility to ensure that these individuals are reformed, rehabilitated, changed, and I don't believe we're doing that if we treat them less than animals. And I hope that that's a fiscal solution that we can utilize in order to address it. It's not hot in December. It's not hot in November. So why, get AC at that time? If we did it then, why couldn't we do it for, as you mentioned, 14% not having air conditioning?
You would need to do it much more than just the 14%, because you would need to do it obviously if the legislature told us that's what you want us to do, we'd be happy to do it. But at the same time, I would tell you, based on what we know from the two temporary solutions we have in place now, and they run really, you're correct, April through roughly October is when you're running those systems. You're not going to run them in the winter months. But the cost of that system is going to be more in the long run of the life of a system than it would be if you put in a system permanently. But it certainly is a short-term solution. It can be brought on very quickly. It's not an efficient system because it's just plumbing in essentially vents that just blow cold air, and there's not any of the ductwork or any of the other efficiencies that go with it. You can certainly do it, and you can do it quickly, but at the same time, on the long haul, you're going to spend, I think, quite a bit more money in the long run if you look at that life of a system.
Well, and I'm just going based on our historical practice.
Yes, sir.
We did it temporarily. Then the courts required that we do it permanently. And I think that it offers some viable solution for us if our conscience drives us, not you. You're simply working with whatever resources we provide you. But there are several ways to do this if we have the desire to do it.
That would be the quickest. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I have a few other questions, but
Yes, sir.
it's going to take a lot more time, so I will just talk with you off in another time. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. All right, Representative Jarvis Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Collier, thank you for your presentation. While I look old, I'm not that old. My high school, the Chinquapin School in Highlands, Texas, the college prep school, we actually didn't have AC in our schools. I lived on campus. It was a college prep school, so it was a boarding school, so we lived on campus. There was no AC in those, in the dorms. So it got hot.
Yes, sir.
But today I looked on the Weather Channel, and it says it's going to be 107 in Austin
Yes, sir.
today. And you had said something about heat-sensitive inmates. I mean, at 107, I think we're all heat-sensitive.
I wouldn't necessarily argue with you. I'm just trying to mark a classification. Yes, sir.
So, I mean, at some point, I mean, everybody's going to be heat-sensitive.
Yes, sir.
And you said that you have roughly 12,000 heat-sensitive inmates
Yes, sir.
currently. And again, I would contend that, I mean, all of them at this point, especially those that are working and oftentimes working outside, I mean, everybody's going to be heat-sensitive. What is the goal in respect to some of the things that are happening? And I was looking at your phases.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, phase 1 through 4, intake facility, and then all your other facilities. I'm a little dismayed because, I mean, generally when I work on something, I try to fix the oldest first
Yes, sir.
before I start working on those that, because you have the intake facilities, which obviously inmates don't stay long
No, sir.
in those intake facilities.
If you go back and look at some of the history of the heat deaths that happened in the early 2000s, intake facilities were a targeted area because people come in acclimated in the summer from a county jail where it is air conditioned. Now when they come in, if they have a heat related, they're heat vulnerable, we move them quickly to air conditioned beds. But that would allow them to be able to stay at the intake facility, go through the intake process if we had more air conditioned beds there. We're doing some now as part of our funding that you gave us, but that would let us do those completely.
Okay. So then go ahead and finish explaining, then why are we doing the pre-1950s last and then doing the prototypes built in the 80s and 90s? We're doing those first and then doing
Trying to look at how much of the system we could get done at one time. We could put the oldest ones first, but they're going to take longer. They're more complicated designs, and we won't get as many of them done. So the number of beds we would have in the system, we would reap more beds with this model is kind of how we were focused on it. We could certainly adjust it any way you would like, but we were looking at how we could accomplish the most beds per biennium to help knock out the whole system and get as much done as we could.
So you have the most population in your prototype facilities in your phase 2, 3?
2 and 3 would be the two that knock out a big piece of your population, and then the last piece would be your oldest, more like the Huntsville unit in Huntsville, Texas. You may not be familiar with it, but it's an 1850s building. We have units that were built in the 1800s. Some of those units are going to be really complicated to design the systems because they're older. They were built essentially to breathe, so they're going to need quite a bit of work to put in the air conditioning and then the infrastructure around it.
And so what would be the cost savings if we just simply took those units out? Because, I mean, we're talking about spending $1 billion.
Yes, sir.
So what would be the cost savings if we just simply said, let's just take this offline? Although, I mean, I know we're in Texas, and I know this is the largest prison population in the country. And when I looked at what are some of the reasons for most of the incarcerations, drugs is the number one incarceration purpose for Texans. And so if we're looking at how do we phase some of these people out simply because of drugs, because we're looking at, in today's society, as we look at what drugs have become, opioids and all those other things, you know, I've heard many times over and over again that these people don't need prison, they need help. And help comes in the form of counseling and things like that, or helping getting on the right track.
Yes, sir.
So what's our move to reduce that population and then maybe close some of these facilities down so that we can spend $1 billion in education as opposed to $1 billion in incarceration?
TDCJ would not be, I mean, we are not actively we don't manage that piece of it. That's not our policy. We do the incarceration piece. But what I can tell you is, as you go down the phases, because we have some idle facilities that are newer than some of the older facilities, if populations don't climb back to where they were, I think those kind of options might exist in 1 or 2 or 3 options. In other words, we were at 142,000 before COVID. We have idled 3 facilities. We've closed 3 facilities since then. Those idle facilities, they might be able to come online and take an older facility offline. But if you need 142,000 beds, you don't have that flexibility. So if our population doesn't return, which frankly I hope it doesn't, but if it did not return to the levels it was, I think some of those options would exist where you could close an older and leave and bring back an idle unit that's newer and try to do it that way. Some of our complications are some of the older units are cell block, and that you have a population of inmates that need to be in cell block housing. It's not all apples to apples because a lot of our units are dormitory as well. So it's managing that. But I do think some options would exist if the population doesn't go up.
And you had mentioned that I understand that your job is to manage the prison population itself, housing, I should say. But you have a great input in when it comes to parole or probation or things like that to say, look, this is a bad person, probably need to stay a little longer, or hey, this person has reformed, whatever the case may be.
Actually, the parole board is independent of.
I understand that, but do you work with it? You don't talk with them at all?
Certainly work with them, but I make no recommendations on who, nor do I on probation either.
And so that being said, then I'll just say this then. If you're looking at some of you had mentioned the number of deaths.
Yes, sir.
From heat. What are some of those numbers of people who've been infirmed because of the heat, maybe heat stroke, or
sure,
is there a number?
Yes, sir.
And then when we look at, as you're looking it up, then what are we looking at in respect to our older population, those people who, again, in prison on drugs but have been there for 30 years, at this point are on either life support or basically hanging on by a thread that obviously is costing the state of Texas millions upon millions of dollars to keep them incarcerated. What does that move look like in order to maybe get some of those people out, to remove them from our prison population so that we can bring some of those numbers down? Because again, I'll harp on the fact that we're not talking about hardened criminals. We're talking about people who, the largest population are people who are incarcerated because of drugs. So, what's going to be our move to, as we are hoping that that number doesn't go up?
Yes, sir.
What's our move to try to get some of those older population out?
I'll take the first piece if
Sure.
I can first real quick. So heat-related illnesses, so I'll give you staff and inmates. So in calendar year 21, we had 4 inmate heat-related illnesses. We had 8 staff. If you go to this year to date, you had 6 inmates so far and 11 staff that have had heat-related illnesses, which would mean they had to go down and they may have received medical care, but it's not just I'm hot. It's obviously more involved than that. That's this year. As far as it relates to our geriatric population, there is a medically recommended intensive supervision program that exists. Still requires the parole board to grant release, but where it's someone who is in a vegetative or terminal potential situation can be reviewed by the parole board. Not all inmates are eligible. It's a pretty small universe, but the board does review those. But I don't know the number right off the top of my head, but I can get you the number of how many they process each year. But they do have an option for that now.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And then lastly, you had mentioned the estimated annual cost will be about $20 million.
Yes, sir.
What's the breakdown on that $20 million to annually operate?
Sure. And Ron may know that includes your increased energy cost. So you can have an increased electric bill basically as a result of the facility adding the air conditioning. And then there's ongoing maintenance and repair.
Yes, Ron Steff, I'm the Chief Financial Officer for TDCJ, and that breakdown is about 13 million of that would be for the increased utilities usage and 7 million for the operations and maintenance.
Okay. And so when we look at, most of our prisons are in treeless areas where there are a whole lot of shade going on. So are there any alternatives to reducing some of that cost? Say, for instance, solar powered on some of these prisons to drive some of that cost down. And so you're using all of this wonderful Texas sun.
Yes, sir.
Is that potentially
We have
an
spoken
option?
to a couple of solar vendors over the years, but nothing recent, and we're not in that practices right now. The amount of solar it would require to run a facility has usually been a kind of a turn back for some of the vendors that we've talked to.
But has it been 20 million?
Oh, no, sir. I'm sorry. We didn't look at it system-wide, just as individual units.
Well, even individual units, because again, I'm just looking at you saying of the 20 million, 13 million is going to be just simple cost.
Yes, sir.
But if we're looking at, this would be a prime opportunity for us to use some of these alternative costs or alternative measures to reducing some of that carbon footprint, as well as reducing the cost to save taxpayers dollars simply by, and it may be a larger cost up front, but my God, over the long haul,
Yes, sir.
I mean, how much money could we potentially save if we are using solar to power some of these, which would give us more of an opportunity of putting more measures in place to
Yes, sir.
make sure that people don't get sick or die.
We can certainly look at that. Yes, sir.
Because I'd like to be able to see what that cost would look like.
Okay.
All right,
Yes, sir.
thank you.
Representative Howard?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for being willing to look at some options here, like what Representative Jarvis was talking about
Yes,
in
ma'am.
terms of taking facilities offline, if that seems to be warranted.
Yes, ma'am.
Sounds like there's some different ways we could approach this, but I just want to clarify a couple of the things that you gave to us. You mentioned the respite areas. Are those air conditioned?
They are. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
And in terms of, I think you mentioned in phase 1, the intake facilities, you also mentioned something about geriatric population.
Yes, ma'am.
That, first off, what are we talking about? I know the chairman asked a while ago about context, and I think that's part of what I'm trying to figure out here too. What are we talking about population-wise when we're talking about geriatric?
To describe it, and I won't cut it at an age, we track people that are 55 and older, but since I'm over 55, I don't consider that old at all. But at the same time, geriatric is not necessarily in that category. But in reality, we have facilities where you have an older population. They're going to be definitely over 55. They may be, but it's not age driven. It's driven more as their medical needs. They may be mobility issues. So many of them may be wheelchair bound. Some of those units, and I'll give you the Gesture 3 unit in Sugar Land as an example of one that would be in this group. It has some partial air conditioning where we've added air conditioning to a couple of the dormitories, and it manages it better, but it would be the entire facility would, that unit, because it's close to Galveston, we house some of the people that need to be transferred to the hospital frequently at that location. So that would be a geriatric unit that we would do under this area. We have another, I think there's one or two other ones that are in the near area, so Rocheron area, that would also get it because they house inmates that are more medically vulnerable that need to make trips regularly
Sure.
to Galveston.
Okay. Thank you, that's helpful. And
Yes,
then,
ma'am.
just to clarify also, contextually on slide 2, units with air conditioning,
Yes, ma'am.
you start with the 14% have no air conditioning in the housing areas, but only 31% have it in all. So in actuality, 70% have at least not some.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think what you were just describing now maybe explains that to a certain extent, limited pockets.
Yes, ma'am. Some of
So-
those are very small. You may have 10 beds, you may have 25 beds that are air conditioned. For instance, we call what is restrictive housing, so that's in the area where you can segregate an inmate by themselves. Typically, that's air conditioned because it's one cell, it's not exposed to outside air, and doesn't have a way to ventilate, so we air condition those. Medical beds in the clinic at the unit would also be considered, they're going to be air conditioned as well, so there may be 10 infirmary beds on a unit that are air conditioned that are also counted. 50 of the, yes, ma'am, 50 of the 55 units have less than, I'm still wrong, 25 of the 55 actually have less than 50
Wait.
or less beds.
25 of the 55, say that again, please.
25 of the 55 units that have some housing air conditioned have 50 or less air conditioned beds.
And when you say units, is it percent or units that you're talking about? Because on here it says
It's,
percent.
so we have 100 units,
So it's
the
one
same. Yes,
one and
ma'am.
the same, okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Um,
And the furthest end of that would be some of those units have 1,800 beds that are air conditioned, but it's not the entire facility.
Okay. Yeah, breaking that down to where it's understandable what we're talking about in terms of
Yes, ma'am.
the number of beds within context would be helpful.
I'd be happy to get you a
Thank
list.
you.
Yes, ma'am, you bet.
And I guess the final thing I would just say is that, again, based on our earlier discussion with the comptroller, this is another potential infrastructure investment I think we could consider if we're willing to. It's a one-time expense, and we are going to be talking about having a large amount of surplus dollars that we don't normally have, that we need to strategically spend in a way that takes us forward, especially with one-time expenditures. So this looks like one of those things that we could certainly look at. I hope
Yes,
that we'll
ma'am.
talk about this as an option. So
Yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Zwiener.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank y'all for being here today.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to thank my colleagues for asking most of the questions I had, but I did have a couple other specific questions. One being, I presume some of the inmates at these facilities are pursuing ways to re-enter on a better foot.
Yes,
They
ma'am.
leave. I know a lot of folks pursue
think by and far
GEDs
most. Yes, ma'am.
or other educational programs. I know I can't focus very well when the temperature is much above 80 somewhere. I'm actually trying to do mental work. I mean, is that something y'all have quantified, just this lost opportunity
Yes,
for
ma'am.
folks who are using their incarcerated time to try and prepare?
I will
for
tell you,
reentry?
most of the units, the education area is air conditioned, if not all, but I can get that information to you as well. And then program units that are specific treatment programs, not all, but I believe the vast majority are air conditioned as well. So the treatment space, education space, because you're exactly right, can't focus if you're hot and having to deal with that. So I think those areas many times are air conditioned. That doesn't account for what's the housing area, but at the same time, of the units that have partial air conditioning, many times it's the school, and it's also the area where we may do programming.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the last year that y'all really had a large number of deaths was 2011.
Yes, ma'am. 2012 was the last deaths. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
And in 2011, you mentioned
2011 was the
particularly
highest. Yes,
big
ma'am.
year. And this appears to be the year that it's going to be hotter
Yes, ma'am.
than 2011.
Yes, ma'am.
With these plans around constructing new air conditioning, are these units that are designed to be able to work as we continue to experience more and more 100-degree days?
Right now, what we do, obviously, we have heat mitigation things that we do all the time between April and October. We also take a whole nother play at it if temperatures go above 105 or if we have a heat index above 113. We do an incident command system at that unit and basically shut activity down, go in and put extra attention to every piece of the detail that we have as it relates to that unit. We also coordinate that with centrally so that centrally we're helping the unit manage anything they may need to get through that time right now. And I can tell you in the last, 13 times this year, and some just in the last few days, where we've actually had to do that, where we've gotten temperatures at that height or higher outside. That's not inside. But if it's 105 or 113 heat index outside, then we go into ICS mode at that facility and then take extra steps.
How many facilities do you have the staff to manage that in at once right now?
Really, any facility would be managing it. So we're short-staffed, no question about it. But at the same time, we're still managing that with the staff that we have. And it's a heightened alert for everyone. Because our staff, I know we're talking about the population of inmates, but our staff are in the same boat. They're in that
Right.
facility working there every day, and it's hot for them too. So we have equal concerns on both.
Okay. And just let me clarify I really appreciate you giving me some info about the response y'all have now. But, our state climatologist is projecting that in the next 15 years we'll see double the number of 100-degree days we've seen historically. Are these units that y'all have estimated cost on, are they designed to handle that future we're hurtling into?
They wouldn't be the best environment. Some of them are. Some of them are facilities that were built. And to caveat this, the newest facility built in Texas that we own, TDCJ, would be in the mid-90s. So nothing's been built, not that I'm asking for that either, please, at the same time, but nothing's been built since probably the mid-90s, but they go back to the 1800s. So some of those old units, it's not going to be easy to air condition because they were built to be cooler. The Memorial unit, which used to be called the Darrington unit, if you look at our logs, it runs in the 80s. Today it's in the 80s. Yet another unit that was built in the mid-90s may be in the 90s because of but that unit was older, built with tall ceilings, built in a way to ventilate. So it will be complicated to air condition, certainly doable, but it's more complicated to do that on an older facility that wasn't designed for it than some of the newer ones.
Okay. And last question, I think you hinted at this a little bit in your presentation. I've heard some concerns about previous cost estimates being high.
Sure.
I know there was particular concerns. There was a facility near College Station where y'all had initially estimated it would cost about $20 million
Yes, ma'am.
to upgrade the AC, and then we're able to do it at $4 million.
Yep.
So I guess I'm sort of asking, how solid are these numbers? Do they account for some of those previous?
The trail
Are the mistakes that led to overestimates in the past corrected?
The 20 million was based on, if I remember correctly, an outside estimate. We came back in with inside, and we did the work ourselves, and that's how we got it down to 5. But we came back in with an inside estimate and did it much cheaper than we were originally looking at. But if I do remember, that was the PAC unit. And that unit initially, based on the design that we got, was going to be 20, or the estimate that we got. We had others look at it and dropped it considerably. So our folks have done that. Also the Hodge unit, which is up near Rush, Texas. We've helped design those, and then they've also designed many of the other air conditioning projects that we're working now. To try to help validate that very concern, we put out 2 of our facility designs for bid that are prototype type designs. So in other words, hopefully that design, it won't necessarily be the same design used, but they can modify from there. And we did that with outside firms, and they came in at where our engineers had estimated it. So we felt confident at that point that our engineers are on the right mark.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Representative Sherman.
Just a couple of more questions. In regards to, you mentioned the ACs and installation. Have we ever used inmates to actually do a part of that work?
Yes, sir. And actually, what we would plan to do, I should have mentioned that, is if we were fortunate enough to receive funding to do this, we would actually escalate significantly the training programs for HVAC within the agency so that we could train more inmates to help us do that, but also give them a career field when they get back out.
I just keep thinking about that. lady who was working
Yes, sir.
on ACs
Yes, sir.
and then going back to the
To
dorm where
non-AC.
there's no AC. As far as lawsuits, pending lawsuits,
Yes, sir.
can you speak to what the liability is for those pending lawsuits? Do you have any information on that? Because I know, I think you mentioned in 2011 was the last recorded death. Are there any pending lawsuits that may be germane to individuals like Seth Donnelly, who passed away in 2019? And I think his internal temperature was recorded at 106 degrees. Are there any cases that are pending and you just can't speak on right now?
I can tell you we have 14 heat litigation cases pending. We have closed 43. We've paid out about $8.8 million in heat litigation expenses.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
All right, well, Mr. Collier, thank you. And
Yes, sir.
I do appreciate all the work that you and your organization have done into coming up with a plan. And
Yes, sir.
I also appreciate you allowing us to ask all these questions. There are a lot of things you have thought through in great detail, but we're just now thinking through some of them, so we have to work through some of that.
Yes, sir.
on
No, thank
our
you
own.
for letting us be here today.
All right, very good. The chair calls Clifton Buchanan with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Texas Corrections, and also Dr. Carly Purdom with the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center at Texas A&M. And members, these are the last two witnesses for this specific charge for today. So we'll hear their testimony and then ask any questions that you may have.
Is the clerk coming back? Chairman Bonin and committee members, my name is Clifton Buchanan. I'm the Deputy Director of ASME Texas Correctional Employees Council 907. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm a retired correctional officer of 26 years, 21 years with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, 5 years with TDCJ in the early 90s. I retired as a South Central Regional Vice President Emeritus for the Bureau of Prisons, a position I served for 9 years. I also served as a statewide AFL-CIO Vice President for 6 years, prior to accepting this position with Texas Correctional Employees Council. Gulf War veteran as well. Texas Correctional Employees Council is an organization made up of thousands of active TDCJ employees who work in every unit under every job title, from correctional officer to food service workers, from substance abuse counselors to maintenance workers. I first want to thank you and this committee for taking on this critical issue that affects not only inmates, but staff as well. And I would like to speak to the part as a person who's worked inside prisons for 26 years of just how it affects staff. TDCJ employs over 23,000 correctional officers who are exposed to the same extreme conditions as the incarcerated. Temperatures at units can reach well above 110 degrees during the summer, and staff must endure this heat while wearing safety equipment such as stab-proof vests. Staff are required to conduct security checks every 30 minutes, which requires them to go up and down staircases. Imagine going up and down stairs at a football stadium in the heat of the day while wearing a coat. That is what these extreme conditions for staff are like. With the staff shortage, these officers are covering multiple pods, multiple housing units, and are constantly conducting these rounds with no break. The heat is not only a deterrent to staff, but it also affects the life and effectiveness of staff-proof vests. This is also a hygiene issue, as staff are required to share the vest. When I worked at the Bureau of Prisons, we had our own vest assigned to us. I didn't share nobody's vest, and I wouldn't do it. These staff share a vest. The sweat and heat can ruin a staff-proof vest. Please see the pictures of those vests that was provided to us under the condition of anonymity by staff. This vest is stiff and brittle. You can see the discoloration and the sweat lines. You can also see that the vest is expired as of February 21st, yet it's still in use, and this picture was taken 6 days ago. Staff are required to share vests and inserts, therefore exposing one another to unsanitary conditions. These concerns increase with COVID and exposing one another. My experience has shown that violence increases when inmates are subject to stressful situations. Extreme heat is a stress factor. When violence increases, it affects staff's safety. Climate control can reduce one of these factors. The state must start looking at every scenario that affects the hiring and retention of staff for TDCJ. Working conditions such as extreme heat is a factor. I can speak to that because that was one of the main reasons that I left from the state to go to the feds. They sold me not knowing anything about the working conditions I was going to face, but other than the fact they said all our units have AC. I said, that's it. I don't need to know nothing else. I'm leaving. Although there was a lot variety in the pay as well. As the age of our correctional officer increases, the effect it has on our own body increases also. Improving working conditions with climate control will improve working conditions and retention as the officers increase in age. Officers work 16 to 18 hours a day. 16 to 18 hours a day, 6 to 8 days straight. Standing on cement floors with no place to sit or rest in this extreme heat. Many officers report heat exhaustion every year and call in sick due to being exposed to heat. Climate control can reduce workers' compensation claims and reduce the numbers of call-ins due to the heat. We must improve staff working conditions. Climate control is one of the many things that can help. If the legislators choose to fund climate control in our prisons, it's critical to ensure that all areas where staff are assigned to work are included. These are also areas where inmates are not allowed, such as pickets, count rooms, even training academies. I am the representative in the Angleton area. I go to the training academy once a week. There's several cadets going through the training outside. There's no classroom space. They're training out in extreme heat. And some of them come to me and say, hey, do whatever you can. Well, we need some AC. We must ensure staff are able to be trained and attentive, so proper procedures can be taught and comprehended. Just last week, an officer asked me, when did AC become a right? Dumbfounded at his question, I asked him, what do you mean? He said, I'm a decorated war veteran with a degree, and I can't get respite from heat.
However, if an inmate requests respite from the heat, they're taken to an area where AC is so they can cool off because, as he said, it's their right. However, I am told if I get heat exhaustion, I will be written up, and inmates have rights, or more rights than I do. And then what he said to me was quite perplexing. I didn't fight for my country for an inmate to have better rights than me. Heat-related disciplinary actions. Heat index, as the director testified, for outside recreation shuts down at a certain temperature. Staff have no respite whatsoever. Most are fortunate if they get a relief to use the restroom at least once during their 8-hour to 12-hour shift or while working 16 to 20 hours a day. The solution can't be just drink more fluids, especially when staff may not even get a restroom break during their shifts. And yes, I've had staff come to me, male and female, tell me I use the restroom on myself. Not because we didn't have enough people to relieve me, but because they didn't want to come relieve me, and I kept calling and no relief came, and then I just used the restroom. I implore each committee member to take at least a 2-hour tour of these prisons, which have no AC, and spend at least 30 minutes not taking a temperature, but stand in those housing units where the correctional officer has to work for 30 minutes and see if you can handle or acclimate to that heat that they're doing for several hours of the day. Just to understand firsthand the need to improve these extreme working conditions. I implore you to do this prior to taking a vote on whether or not to fund climate control. For the greatest asset of TDCJ is its brave men and women employees who come to work each and every day, despite knowing the conditions they're going to face. Thank you again for inviting me to speak today. In law enforcement, where staff are tasked with working physically demanding and dangerous jobs, we must do everything we can do to provide them with the best working conditions possible. We hope we can continue to work with legislation on improving these dehumanizing working conditions. I've heard a lot about the inmates, and I do sympathize with the inmates. In my career, I always tried to treat them as if they might be one of my family members. And I said before I would do something harmful to them, what would you do if that was your brother or your sister or your aunt, which is always somebody's family member? But I'm urging you to think about the staff also, who are actually productive citizens and taxpayers, and how we utilize the money that they're given to as well. And let them know that you appreciate them, because the one thing that COVID didn't stop, it doesn't stop crime, it doesn't stop incarceration, and these brave men and women have come to work every day under these conditions, and that's the least thing we can do is show them our respect that we have for them. I will be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Let's hear from Dr. Purdom, and then, so don't go anywhere.
Yes, sir.
And then we will proceed to questions.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Dr. Carly Purdom. I'm a research professor at Texas A&M University for the Hazard Reduction and Recovery Center. Thank you for inviting me to testify today and present information about a recently published report that I have previously submitted electronically to your Appropriations Committee staff. Let me begin with a statement, which is more of a common observation for anyone who has spent time in Texas, especially lately. Throughout the history of imprisonment in Texas, it has been documented that incarcerated people and prison staff have experienced harm from extreme weather conditions and at times a lack of adequate protections. Although 87% of households in the U.S. use air conditioning equipment today, only approximately 30% of Texas prison units are fully air conditioned. According to a 2014 report from the Human Rights Clinic of the University of Texas School of Law, temperatures inside units consistently exceed 90 degrees, and at least one unit has been shown to have topped 149 degrees on the heat index. Conditions of high humidity in Texas prisons have also contributed to adverse health impacts from heat. The number of incarcerated people who have fallen ill or died from exposure to extreme temperatures throughout the state's history is unknown, yet notable clusters of heat-related deaths and illnesses have occurred. At least 23 documented heat-related deaths of incarcerated people have been recorded by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice since 1998. In 2018 alone, at least 79 incarcerated people and prison staff members reported heat-related illnesses between January and October. Without air conditioning throughout all units, TDCJ policies primarily prioritize mitigating the impact of extreme temperatures by getting resources to incarcerated people individually. Aside from the limited access to cooled beds or air-conditioned housing areas, these policies include providing drinking water, ice used to cool water temperature, additional cooled showers when possible, fans, and access to cooled respite areas. According to TDCJ, the agency's policies are meant to provide sufficient heat mitigation efforts for incarcerated persons and units without air conditioning. However, TDCJ has also noted in 2019 that in practice, implementing this strategy is difficult, and that mitigating the risk of heat impacts across the state's now 101 units, which have approximately 120,000 incarcerated persons with varying medical vulnerabilities and security characteristics, presents a unique challenge and requires a comprehensive system-wide approach. Despite the current heat mitigation policies, nearly every year there are reports of incarcerated persons and staff falling very ill and or dying from complications from extreme heat in Texas prisons. The report I have submitted to the committee details an analysis of 309 surveys from incarcerated persons that were collected by the Texas Prisons Community Advocates, or TPCA, through citizen science efforts between 2018 and 2020. The surveys developed by TPCA asked incarcerated persons to describe their experiences with heat illness based upon these heat mitigation policies currently in place with TDCJ. The report primarily focuses on access to water and ice, additional showers, cooled respite areas, and commissary items. In analyzing these surveys, we identified consistent patterns of challenging experiences with heat mitigation policies across units. These patterns were also supported by previous news reporting, published research articles and reports, and other documentary evidence. These challenges stem, as TDCJ noted before, in the difficulties of getting heat mitigating resources to 120,000 people, not including prison staff, individually, every single day when the heat mitigation policies go into effect. Some key findings from the report include heat in Texas prisons is degrading incarcerated people's mental and physical health and exacerbating pre-existing conditions. The true impact of heat on the number of deaths of incarcerated persons, as well as prison health costs, has not been truly assessed, but it is significant. In 2019, the state spent over $750 million on prison health care, a 53% increase from 7 years earlier, when that cost was less than $500 million. These costs can be expected to increase over time as the incarcerated population becomes more vulnerable with each year over time as they're exposed to extreme heat. This will also increase the healthcare burden in communities across Texas to which incarcerated persons may return upon release. Overall, participants described a strong sense of fear and mistrust of the prison system to protect them from heat-related illness and death. This kind of mistrust can lead to destabilization within units and increased violence, which can also lead to costly lawsuits. Participants described not having adequate access to resources, including water, ice, showers, and access to cooled respite areas. Units rely on water coolers and common areas to dispense water to incarcerated people, but they frequently run out due to demand. It is a burden on staff to continuously fill and clean them, not to mention fetching ice to keep the water cooled. Reports of dirty coolers with bugs or vermin inside them were common, and participants described fear of drinking the water, which could also lead to heat-related illness. Participants frequently described being denied access to showers and cooled respite areas due to staff being overwhelmed with constant demand, limited space and resources, and broken infrastructure. Current policies emphasize certain infrastructure in prisons, including fans, blowers, ice machines, water coolers, showers, and respite areas. The extreme demand on these infrastructure leads to degradation over time, which are costly to replace. Extreme heat has also been shown to degrade and compromise building and material infrastructure as well. Participants described the constant back and forth with prison staff over getting water coolers cleaned and refilled, ice for the water, additional showers, and access to cold respite areas, while in the context of extreme heat, also creates significant tension, especially as staff are already overworked and overwhelmed with their security-related responsibilities, and incarcerated persons are fearful of heat-related illness and death. Tension, mistrust, and incidents of violence in prison systems has a traumatic and chilling effect on staff retention and recruitment, which can be extremely costly to the system. These are just a few of the findings from our report, which I hope you will thoroughly examine. The lack of air conditioning in prisons across Texas has been argued to be in violation of human rights, the U.S. Constitution's 8th Amendment to protection against cruel and unusual punishment, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal protection to citizens, as well as the Americans with Disabilities Act and Rehabilitation Act. Extreme heat disproportionately impacts incarcerated people with medical and mental health vulnerabilities, but can also create them in previously healthy persons. Such vulnerabilities are overrepresented in prison systems across the U.S. and in Texas. This issue is only going to continue to worsen with increasing annual temperatures and an increasing number of days over 100 degrees in Texas. The lack of cooling in prisons will continue to exacerbate the degradation of health for both incarcerated people and staff. To continue to attempt to mitigate the risk of heat illness by getting resources to individuals is like attempting to mitigate flood risk by only passing out sandbags. The pressure on prison staff to be responsible for the lives and safety of incarcerated people, their fellow officers, as well as their own selves in a hazardous heated environment has been shown to increase staff turnover and negatively impact recruitment. Lawsuits against the state may continue and grow in number, not only related to death and illness from extreme temperatures, but also from incidents of violence within prisons that could be mitigated by implementing cooling throughout the system. In conclusion, implementing system-wide structural mitigation by adding air conditioning to units will reduce costs related to heat hazards by reducing costly damage to infrastructure, reducing physical and mental health-related costs for incarcerated persons, reduce funds used to fend off lawsuits to the state from both heat-related illness and death, but also from other potential violence, and reduce costs of overtime and costs for recruiting and training a constant flow of new staff. Investing in true hazard mitigation efforts that mitigate the intensity of heat and not just the symptoms of heat exposure will make incarcerated people and those that work in prisons safer. I thank the committee for your consideration and time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Representative Sherman?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your service to our country, sir. The information that you have both provided is very compelling, very thought-provoking, and hopefully it inspires some action from our legislative body. You talk about the impact on those who work in our system as well. And that's certainly important, and it's the reason that I've advocated for a study on the impact on correctional officers who work in our system. And that was due to a gentleman named Reginald Moore out of Houston, Texas, who passed away about 2 or 3 years ago. He was the one who disclosed Sugarland 95, which was a cemetery that was built in Imperial, I think it is, cemetery there in Sugarland. You mentioned that sometimes the threat of an officer getting written up for asking to go to the restroom or respite, do you think that that's also a threat to those who are serving time, that are incarcerated? Because I know you mentioned that they have rights, but if that's happening to the employees, which you've acknowledged, what do you think the chances are it happening to those who are incarcerated?
So they don't get written up if they request respite. If they get a heat-related illness, injury, that's when the write-up comes. I have a hearing that I have to represent a staff member coming up. She said she needed respite. They never gave her no respite. She continued to work. Exhaustion set in. She almost fell out. They wrote her up for inattention to duty. In reality, staff seen her fall, and the inmate came and grabbed her and poured water on her until staff came and held her up. So yes, they see that.
And
I've worked in those conditions, and I know it troubles me to hear them, but I just wait till I get in writing, and, it's a reality.
And you're here to advocate for them, and we are concerned about them, and that's why we supported a 15% increase in pay.
And they're happy about that.
And we are too. We wish we could do more. But I want to go back to just the whole thing of written up. If that threat is among the workforce, and I have visited many of our units
Yes, sir.
and spent hours in those units, in the heat, in a suit, and just as you're speaking for them, I have seen letters that have documented, according to the person who is subject to this, saying that they have been written up because they asked for a respite too.
I'm not in a position to really speak on what the inmates, because I haven't worked inside the prison since I retired in 2019. But I would not doubt it, because it's believable. But it does send a chilling effect. If that officer's working in that cell block with you 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day, and that officer's making sure you get to go where you need to go and do what you need to do, and making sure you got everything that's coming to you, inmate's not going to treat that officer bad, because that inmate knows when so-and-so's working, everything's going to be taken care of. So if they see something happen to an officer, yes, of course they're going to be like, well, if they do it to them, what do you think they're going to do to me? But I haven't had that reported to me, because only the staff tell me what's going on. So I don't want to send the wrong message.
Yes.
But what you're saying is very conceivable, because they do watch everything that goes on.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Dr. Purdue?
I can say in getting surveys from incarcerated people, it was a common experience for them to have negative interactions with staff regarding heat mitigation policies that may lead to a write-up or a case. For example, water coolers. If their water coolers run out and they're wanting water, that can create a tense situation between the incarcerated people and the staff member who they're wanting to refill that water or add ice to that water. So it can create those tense exchanges that can lead to a write-up. There are also certain access to those resources. So in talking about water coolers, what do you need to use a water cooler? You need a cup. That was a very common description in our surveys, was not having access to a cup. So you're given a small cup, and if you lose that cup, if you break that one cup, you might want to use a different item to get the water. You might, there were reports of, because the ice inside the water becomes so valuable when it's so hot, that folks will crack the top of the cooler and go in with their hands to grab the water, which also creates a tense exchange between incarcerated people, because it's making it unsanitary or gross. There are certain items you can get from commissary to mitigate heat illness, supposedly. That may be fans, cooling towels, cooling t-shirts, electrolyte drinks, and if you have those in a place where you're not supposed to, or if you have not the correct number of those items you're supposed to have, you can get written up for a case. But I believe the most problematic is just the tense exchanges that in getting those resources creates between staff and inmates. So in wanting to get access to respite, you're talking about the education building or the infirmary. If you have units filled with hundreds, even thousands of people, how many individuals can have access to respite at one time? So how many incarcerated people were denied access to respite because it's full, or the officer may be having to try to make decisions about maybe this inmate is more sick than the other, and it puts this really complicated burden on them to have to decide who gets access to potentially life-saving resource. And that's incredibly stressful when incarcerated people can't get access to that resource. It's very tense and creates a lot of tense exchanges between staff and incarcerated people, which can lead to negative situations, obviously.
I've seen the individuals covet the position of being able to produce the ice, to work in the freezer areas, to produce the different shapes of ice. And they're excited about that work because they get to work in a cool environment. And then the other group that transports the ice to the inmates. Have you done any research on the cost of actually having this ice production inside of our prisons?
Sure. I know that the maintenance of ice machines can be costly, and the purchase of coolers, endless numbers of coolers that may get dirty or stop working, has been costly. We do have references to specific numbers in our report on how much TDCJ has spent on having to repair broken ice machines. But imagine when we're talking about thousands of people demand on ice machines, on coolers. It's a constant breaking down, wear and tear on that infrastructure. Whereas if you were to be in a cooler environment, demand on that infrastructure would not be as intense, and then you would have less wear and tear, and those resources and infrastructure would certainly last a longer amount of time.
The impact on the infrastructure is great, and would love to get that information. One of the things, and this is my last question, that I'm concerned about as a former city manager, having the impact of having a prison in our city and the times that ambulance had to be called out. The cost for that was, the revenue that we generated as a municipality from the county because of the cost of sending public safety out, our paramedics out, was enormous for us. Now, when you look at that from a municipality perspective, it's dangerous because it ties up our folks at these facilities because of heat-related issues that could be mitigated if the desire was there.
Absolutely, and I think that brings up a fantastic point of just the number of illnesses and deaths that are related to heat are wildly, wildly underestimated. And I say because in that environment you have that constant exposure to heat, and so that can degrade your health over time. So it could be heart attacks that may not have happened. It could be mental episodes that may not have happened. For example, when we talk about the impact of taking psychotropic medications for mental illness, that inhibits your body's ability to regulate temperature. And so we have anecdotal reports of folks who say they stop taking their medications in the summer because they don't want to die from heat illness. So they're not maybe taking the medications that they need to prevent them from having a suicidal ideation. That the number of suicide attempts are higher in the warmest months of the year. So you do have these likely medical emergencies that would decrease if they were able to have access to a cooler environment. Our team at Texas A&M are going to be trying to look at that, at ambulance data and EMS call data, and what the demand, what kind of demand that puts on to local medical infrastructure.